I do want to open the series and kind of reiterate some of the things that Anna shared with us last week. She reminded us that the church, and specifically our church, should be a place where we can be who we are. We shouldn't have to dress up our feelings as if everything's okay, or to deny that we have problems or that we're hurting in some way. And the purpose of this series really is to help each of us recognize our own needs and to provide real practical conversational information on mental health and mental health flourishing. And we're really, really pleased that Sun Wellness and Counseling agreed to come along on the journey with us. They too value mental health education. And in addition to doing mental health education, they provide mental health counseling, nutrition services, integrative wellness, and a host of other things. Today, I'm really excited that Jackie Greco is with us, and she is a licensed clinical mental health counselor. And since that's such a mouthful for me to get out, I'm going to let Jackie tell you the rest about herself. So anyway, Jackie, welcome. We're really, really pleased to have you and look forward to the conversation today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Gerald, for that warm introduction. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here so everybody can see what it is that I'm looking at. Can everybody see my slideshow? Can I get some thumbs up? Cool. Okay. And now before we get started, one thing that was brought to my attention, because this is the second installment of the Flourish series that Sun Counseling and Wellness is doing for First Presbyterian, is that if you would like to chat and use the chat function to be able to participate in the conversation today, you're more than welcome to do so. If you're not up to feeling like you want to take yourself off of mute to say something, I would recommend though that if you did, you would send that to Gerald, because I'm not going to be able to see that on my screen, being that I'm going to be presenting. So if there's something that you want to say, your voice is important and it matters, and if typing it would be easier, send it as a direct message or to the group in general, and that way then it can be brought to my attention and Gerald can bring it up for me. But yeah, so again, thank you for having me on this snowy morning. We're going to leave here today and be able to go off and have the most authentic snow day of your life. Hopefully that would be the goal once we're finished today. But my name is Jackie Greco. I am a clinical mental health counselor, which is definitely a mouthful. I've been in practice for 6 years. I've worked with college students on a college campus. I've also worked in other private practice settings, working with individuals from teens up through adults of any age, and I also work with couples. So I'm really excited to be here with you today and to talk to you about showing up authentically and what that means. And I know last week, for the folks who were able to listen to Juliet and Sheba kick off the Flourish series, they talked about values and coping skills and the importance of clarifying our values so that we can use them kind of as like our North Star for the decisions that we make in our day-to-day lives. Values are so important, and knowing what your personal values are is so important for you to be able to live an authentic life. If you didn't get the chance to tune into that last week, I know that there's a recording, is that correct, that you can view? Yeah. On the website, and I definitely think it would be worth your time. There's some really great nuggets of insight there, in addition to learning about basic ways for coping when we are sitting with feelings or thoughts that we want to work through. So I think that that's worth noting. But that presentation from last week, I think, is a great lead into what we're going to talk about today, which is showing up authentically and choosing to live an authentic life, which is one that's in our values. So we will go ahead and jump right in. This is going to be our agenda for the day. So first, we're going to talk about what authenticity is and get that a definition. Then we're going to talk about what is required to practice authenticity, what gets in the way of being authentic, and how we address those barriers of what gets in the way. And we'll start with a quote from Brené Brown. And Brené Brown is like a rock star in the world of counseling and self-improvement. Brené Brown is a research professor, author, and podcast host who's dedicated most of her work to looking at vulnerability, connection, and leadership, which includes authenticity. So this is a quote from her. Authenticity is the daily practice of letting go of who we think we are supposed to be and embracing who we are. It's about the choice to show up and be real, the choice to be honest, the choice to let our true lives be seen, right? Pretty powerful quote. And what Brené's speaking to here is this idea of being aligned with who you are and what you do, right? And when those two things are aligned, that's when we find authentic behavior. And we can relate that back to values, right? If who I am is a very outgoing, gregarious, persistent, energetic person, and I value those things about myself, I might make a really great salesman or saleswoman, right? If I have a really hard time asking people for things and feeling uncomfortable with the idea of, making pitches to people, and I'm in a sales role, that might be a values conflict, right? Like what I'm supposed to be doing doesn't feel true to who I am and what it is that how I see myself and how I identify with myself. Whereas, who you are and what you do, if I'm somebody who really values rest and relaxation, and what I do on the weekends is sleep in every Saturday and Sunday because it's something that I make the time for, then great, right? That means that my values of what I want to do and who I am get to be in line. And that's a beautiful thing, right? When our values and what we choose to do align, it's like parallel lines. It feels good. There's no conflict there, right? And that's where we think about authentic behavior. But then when we think about alien behaviors, think about when our personal values don't align with what we wind up doing. And then ask yourself, what's driving that behavior? Is it a professional value, right? This doesn't feel like who I am, but I feel like I have to be this person or do these things for my work. Or is it a societal value? I don't like the way that healthy food tastes, but what these certain salads and things are, but I feel like I need to try them because that's the trend right now that's going on in the world of health and wellness. When we see, or maybe it's a family value that we don't necessarily agree with the rest of our family, right? And so our family, an example could be family getting together over the holidays and maybe you feeling really uncomfortable about COVID, but the rest of the family says, getting together is more important. And you're going, safety, right? And now we've got this conflict. So when we look at that, when we think about when our behavior doesn't align with our values, that's this values conflict. That's this clash. And that clash, I think, is where a lot of us get stuck when it comes to the idea of living an authentic life, right? Values congruency is easy. What I want to do is what I'm doing. There's no issues. But when our values are at conflict, when they're at war, we have a question in front of us and we have a choice to make. And one of the results of feeling this push and pull between who we are and what we do, I think can be likened to this idea of mask wearing, right? When we go out into the world, or even sometimes when we're reflecting within ourselves, there's this version of who we want to be seen as, this ideal identity, compared to what might more be the true and congruent, but also perhaps unwanted or undesired part of ourselves. And we all wear masks, right? The way that I am with my friends is going to look a little bit different than the way that I am with my coworkers, than with my boss, than with my parents, than with my siblings, or when my family is all together, parents and siblings, right? So this looks different depending on the relationship, depending on the person. But here are some questions that I want you to take just a minute to think about, and then I'm going to open up the floor for some feedback. So when do you notice you wearing masks? Are there ever times you feel comfortable to go mask free? And if so, when? What are those circumstances? And what might you be trying to hide when you do wear masks? Just take a second. If you want to jot something down on a piece of paper, if you're feeling reflective, or just take a minute to think about that to yourself, and then I'll get us sharing in just a minute here.
When do you notice you wear them? I guess masks. These are not waterproof.
Okay, does anybody feel comfortable to share? You can share any one of these answers. You can just share a thought in general about wearing masks. Does anybody have any insight about what it means to wear masks and when they notice it, when they notice they might not need to, what they might be trying to hide when they are?
How do you know which one is the real you?
Great question, right? So sometimes these values are so ingrained in us from society, from wherever, that then it becomes a question of, is this a value that I'm holding and a behavior that's important to my values, or is this a behavior that's important to somebody else that somebody told me I should be? And how do I discern the difference between the two? Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing that.
So Jackie, got a question in the chat that said, can you address the difference between wearing a mask and stretching yourself to do something outside your comfort zone, but
Yeah.
is illegal or immoral? So
yeah. So I think it comes down to a choice point in values, right? Because this idea of stretching ourselves can still be authentic, right? I feel nervous, but I'm going to do something that scares me anyway because I want to grow, right? Oh man, how about public speaking makes me nervous, but it's something that, it also makes me feel fulfilled. So I'm going to do it anyway, right? Having to let's say ask a follow-up question when a client says no, and in my heart feels uncomfortable to do, might be important to me because I know that it's something that's important to my job, and that the point of it is to follow up and show commitment in XYZ, right? But then there's this values pull sometimes between the morals and ethics behind, again, what we feel, and then what it is that we're representing, whether that's ourselves or the company we work for, or the the group of people that we're with, or our family, whatever it might be. And that question can really depend, right? It depends on your comfort level with the choice that you're making and the value that you're standing behind, which sometimes can be that I can adopt values from society and from my family and from my job. But that there are going to be times where I reach a point where personally my morals, ethics, and values, that's it goes beyond stretching it to be that I'm really actually walking away from it, right? So there's a difference between saying I'm still within my bounds of trying to be who I am and work within that, versus I don't recognize who this person is, but I feel the need to be this person for XYZ reason. I hope that answers the question. Yeah. Anybody else?
I like what you're saying, that I feel the need to be that other person. So I do that.
Yeah, right. So go ahead.
So therefore, I try to figure out who is the real me, and I'm not sure I know. I walk twice a day, and I have about all my life. So now my family says, that's who you are. You walk twice a day. But I make myself walk twice a day.
Mm-hmm.
So who is the real me?
Yeah, Nancy. Well, and I
I'm
think
not
so.
sure.
Yeah, it's a good question, right? Are we used to doing these habits and not thinking about the why behind them? Because that comes back to values clarification, and that comes back to also honoring ourselves and even knowing what our preferences are, right? Why am I doing this? Asking the why can be really important. Am I doing it because I've been walking twice for however many years and that's just something that I'm used to doing, right? Or do I do it because I love getting outside, or because I love visiting with people, or because I like the way that exercise makes me feel? And maybe it is those things, and we're just not necessarily bringing them, they're more unconscious than they are conscious, and bringing awareness to them means that we can lift that awareness. But also sometimes when we take a step back and say oh, why am I doing this? Sometimes that question comes up, and really it's kind of I'm not sure why, or I guess because I thought that I should, right? We're going to talk about should statements later. So it is this idea of starting to really think, what is important to me, right? And how do I clarify what it is that is important to me in my life oftentimes by the values that are important to me, that's a great place to start if we're asking those kinds of why questions. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. Anybody else?
You.
Hello.
Hey,
Hi.
Jackie. I'm Martha Mallory, and until Nancy started talking, I thought I was probably the oldest one in this group. Hey, Nancy. But anyway, and I apologize for being so, in a word, I guess one word, simple-minded. But well, all right. So here's for me.
Yes.
It is a gift to be older,
Mhm.
and a gift to spend your life realizing there's no reason to wear a mask.
Mm.
I
Mhm.
mean, right? It's a lot of trouble to wear a mask. And a lot of
Yeah.
people on this thing know me and know that probably if they want to know the truth about something, they can find it from me. So anyway, that's to keep things simple. It's nice to be old. That's it.
Martha and Nancy, thank you for sharing those truths. And Martha, yeah, it can be exhausting to wear a mask. It is, right? Because we're having to put all of this energy sometimes into being the version of ourselves that we think is the most palatable for other people, right? Which is oftentimes where we decide for ourselves that that's the right thing to do, right? That putting on the mask is the right thing because we want to become palatable, right? We want to be liked. And, that's not coming from a bad place. Really and truly, our brains are hardwired to want connection and belonging, right? That is something biologically about us that every human being, that's the way that our brain works. We're hardwired to want to connect and belong. And we're going to be sensitive to anything that threatens that sense of connection and belonging, which can be a big motivator in the moment for why we choose to do the things that we do and put on the masks that we wear, right? But consequence of that means that we might be less likely to feel comfortable and share our true feelings and our real thoughts and feelings because we're trying to protect ourselves, right? These masks are there to protect ourselves in terms of not threatening our sense of belonging and connection. And that brings us to discuss what gets in the way of authentic sharing and doing. And the first part about that is that authenticity requires vulnerability, and vulnerability is a scary thing for a lot of people, understandably, right? Vulnerability is the source of authenticity because it requires that we show our humanity, right? Nobody is perfect. Everybody has moments in life where they don't want to do the things that they're responsible to do, or doesn't like everybody that they come into contact with. That's okay, right? There are times when we don't feel like going with the flow. Everybody has moments like that. But to admit that requires stepping out of that ideal, the way that we want to be perceived self, and taking off a mask and showing our humanity, like showing our true selves. And that requires transparency, right? It starts with ourselves, and then it also relates to how we are or are not transparent with others. And I want to take a second to really talk about transparency with the self, right? Because, and Nancy alluded to this idea, right, of being like, sometimes we're so used to doing things a certain way that we don't even question who says, right? Am I doing this because it's something that I want to do, or a value that's important to me, or something that enriches my life or brings significance and meaning to my life? Or is that because I just have been doing it because whatever reason, somebody else said that I should, or I grew up learning that this was the way, or, this is how we do it in the office, so that's just how I have been doing it. And transparency with the self is so important because that's where that acknowledgement and recognition starts in the first place. Sometimes it's hard to be honest with ourselves, right? I can think about times growing up where I've gotten feedback that, even if it's been constructive about work or school, that sometimes is like, oh, okay, that is helpful. And also, wow, like that is, maybe not the easiest pill to swallow in the moment. But if I can't be honest with myself, right, and give myself a fair assessment about what I think and what is important, then I'm not going to be able to even identify whether or not I'm feeling out of line or in line with my values. So even sometimes if we can't be transparent with other people, i.e., if you work in customer service, you might not be able to tell a customer to leave and never come back again, and don't you ever show your face in here again. You know, you can at least be honest with yourself and be like, it's okay to be frustrated by this situation, or it's okay for me to be feeling impatient right now. Like, that's okay. We don't have to do anything with our thoughts and our feelings, right? There are 1,000 thoughts and feelings that we have in a day. We're going to talk more about this later. We get to decide what we do with them. But even I'm going to admit it to myself instead of being like, I'm not bothered. I'm not bothered. I'm not bothered. Like, admit to yourself, it's okay. Yeah, I'm bothered. Or sometimes these things bother me. That's half of the battle, is being transparent with ourselves. And then that allows us the opportunity to be transparent with other people. But being authentic does not mean bearing all. So that it does not necessarily mean flaunting all the details of your personal life with every single stranger on the street, right? What it means is sharing your story with select few people in your life who you wisely and strategically pick, who are going to hold your vulnerability and your authenticity in a safe space. So there is a balance, right? Like, there are going to be times where you choose to share, and there are going to be times where you might choose to remain silent. If at the very least internally we are being transparent and honest with ourselves, that's a huge step. And then when it comes to the people that we've chosen in our life that can hold vulnerability in a safe space, that's where we can tastefully express vulnerability and align ourselves in our values, right? It's like, sometimes it's okay to speak the truth without saying all of it. I'm having a rough day sometimes is really better than saying I'm doing great when you're really not, right? And maybe we might not say that, for example, to a customer who is, asking nonchalantly, oh, how's your day going? But it might be for a coworker that we feel comfortable with, right? Who's going to ask, and we can give a more honest, authentic, and vulnerable answer. Yeah, and I think one thing to really point out here is that vulnerability doesn't have to be a good or a bad thing. It's just something that is, right? Like, it is something that is required, and it is okay to speak your truth. And I think that this quote is a great quote. I'd rather be whole than good. Carl Jung is a psychotherapist who talks about this idea that there's shadow and light in everything in life, right? And there can't be one without the other. So this idea about, being good lends itself to being like perfect, an ideal self of whatever we perceive other people wanting us to be looked at as. But that's not whole, right? Because if humanity means that we are more than that, we are this complex thing that is good and bad and light and dark, we're not going to be whole if all we're trying to do is put out this ideal mask self to the world. And that's really what Carl Jung is getting at here, which I think leads us into another thing that gets in the way. So vulnerability is a hard thing, that's one thing. But another thing that gets in the way of authenticity is this trend of toxic positivity. It's always been around, but it's become pretty popular lately as a way of being, right? Which is that it's positive vibes only, right? And that's what we're gonna go with. Can anybody give me an example of what toxic positivity looks like, sounds like? Does anybody have an idea or an example that comes to mind for them? Anyone? It's okay if not.
Jackie, I've got one that may be way off base, but it's one that I would offer up.
Please.
For people that are on social media, they look at their own lives in comparison, and people don't post, I'm feeling sad today, I'm depressed today. They post, I took a hike, this is the peak, look at me, I'm in a great place, I'm sailing in the Caribbean, I'm doing wonderful things, my life is full and complete, and that's me. What I'm posting is who I am all the time. And by comparison, that becomes pretty toxic to folks that aren't having those kinds of days.
David, yes, that's a great example. And actually, social media this is where I was going to talk about social media in the context of of being authentic and showing not just the good, right? But the fact that there's other things going on. That is a fantastic example, David. Anybody else?
Sometimes I hear, you always have to look for the silver lining, or
Yes.
you also can hear everything happens for a reason,
Yes.
which, is a whole other issue. And there's a great book about that. But David, I laugh when you
Didn't hear
mentioned,
what David said.
What's that?
I didn't hear what David said.
So David was speaking to this idea that when we use social media, so often what is shown is just the positive light, right? Is the light in people's lives. So we're not showing, I had a fight with my spouse today. We're not showing, I woke up and I feel super unmotivated and can't bring myself to do the things that I need to do today. We're not showing I feel overwhelmed by my 3 kids' soccer games that I have to go to. We're showing only the positives, right? So, he used the example of hiking, the peak of the mountain, right? And an inspirational quote to boot that's probably underneath it, right? This idea that we're only showing one side of ourselves, and it's the side of ourselves that is popular, right? And that people are going to get likes on. People are going to be way more likely to like a post about being at the top of a mountain than a post of somebody in their bed saying, not feeling it today, right? So there's definitely something to that. And social media is a tricky beast because we can get away with that. And then for those who are looking at it on the other end of the screen, thinking to themselves, oh my gosh, this is everybody else's life. Everybody else is climbing mountains and taking these exotic vacations, and look at their family for this family photo. Their family is perfect, right? Whereas if I'm only seeing one side of that person's life, but I know the reality of my life, which is that there's good, but then there's also things that are challenging. Now, all of a sudden, I feel like I'm in this space of a deficit. What's wrong with me, right? And why don't I have that? What's going on? What am I doing wrong? When, the reality is that, and David, that's a great example. And I'm sorry, there was somebody else who was speaking, who was saying silver lining, which is another great example, right? So somebody says to you, for example, that they just got a medical diagnosis, right? And if the reaction is to be like, well, look on the bright side, because this means you're going to get to share more time with family. Or, well, the silver lining is that this really makes you think about life and how you should live it to the fullest. What we're doing is in those statements basically saying, but positivity, right? And we're neglecting to acknowledge, and we're dismissing a person's wholeness and humanness, which is that, pain and suffering happens too, not just positive, happy, love, and light. And it's so important to acknowledge the duality of our or the complexity rather of the emotional spectrum that happens in the human experience, right? It's the whole gamut. We can't know what it is to be joyous without knowing what it feels like to feel sorrow, right? And we can't appreciate what it feels like to feel connection and belonging if we haven't had moments in our life where we know what it feels like to be lonely. These are things that there's always going to be a dark and a light to. And if we only acknowledge one side, we're not acknowledging a whole person. And if part of being authentic is showing our humanness, that vulnerability of being a whole person and a whole self, that means it's not always going to be just the bright and shiny stuff, right? I don't know if anybody here watches Ted Lasso, but I think Ted Lasso is a show that is a great example of what toxic positivity can look like, and how only being positive all the time does have its limitations. And I'm not going to give it away because I'm not a spoiler. I'm not going to do that to you all. Maybe that's what you choose to do once you get off this call, is start watching Ted Lasso. But there is this idea that, negating or dismissing a person's wholeness does have consequences, even if it's just making somebody walk away feeling like they're not heard, or feeling like they can't show the side of themselves that's struggling or in pain, right? And if people aren't sharing it, then we don't have an opportunity to connect with them on that, and they don't have an opportunity to feel connected to. And so I think, in theory, it sounds like this good idea to focus on the good, but really it's about focusing on all of it. I mean, think about the pandemic, right? There's always this dark and this light to it. There's people who are dying every day, and there are people who are, learning how to, engage in hobbies that they haven't ever been able to do because now they work from home, and people who are spending more time with their families than they ever have before, right? Or the opposite of that might be true. There are people who, because of the pandemic and working from home, feel more stressed out than ever because they feel glued to their computer and they don't have a break, right? It really depends on the person. It depends on the situation, but to understand that there is darkness and there is light in everything, right? Positivity and negativity, they're neither good nor bad. It's just about the fact that without one another, we're unbalanced. And to be a whole person, there's going to be both. So toxic positivity is tricky in that way, and it gets in the way. We got to own up to our complexities of being a human. That's okay. That's a beautiful thing. That's what makes us so unique and special.
Jackie,
Yes.
I think about the way we have raised our children, or what we have done or are doing to our children, and so often we don't let them or don't want them to express their negative emotions, their sadness. We don't let them be sad or be scared or be fearful. At least in my parenting, I'm older, but at least in my parenting, I think I was guilty of saying, "Oh, sweetie, don't be sad. Let's go bake cookies," or "It's going to be okay," versus letting them really sit in their fear or sadness, acknowledge that emotion, and not making them push it down into their being, which comes out later, but really allowing your friends or your children to have a negative emotion and acknowledge it and be with them in that.
Yeah, Susan, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And yeah, I think that the thing about it is toxic positivity and other kinds of, even you're saying guilt, we're going to talk about guilt. Those reactions oftentimes come from such a genuinely good place, right? So it's not just, we want to take away suffering. We see suffering happening, and this idea of saying like, well, don't be sad, be happy, or think about it this way. It comes from such a good-hearted and good-natured place, which is then can be hard to spot and be like, oh, is at the expense of that, am I taking away this person's opportunity to work through that emotion, rather than, to your point, pushing it down or pushing it back? Because what we know about emotions is if we don't deal with it, it comes back up, right? To deal with it, or to heal, you gotta deal. is I think a way to think about it. So thank you for sharing that. Yeah, it's so much easier said than done, right? Like, we're talking about it in very high level terms, but these are the things that come up for people that make it an ongoing conscious decision to think about our behavior and what we say and how it comes across and how it's received. So thank you for sharing that. Absolutely.
So, and Jackie, as you're talking, and I mean, to use Susan's example, it sounds like toxic positivity hurts both the person who exhibits it and the person who witnesses it. And I look at Dion's comment, the one she just wrote, is that you hurt someone else when you exhibit your own toxic positivity, but you're also hurting yourself. And then going back to Susan's example, with children, for example, you maybe deny them the opportunity to learn to work through a feeling, but you also deny yourself the opportunity to be real with them, to sit with them. So it's it hurts on two different sides.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, twofold. And I think that is great insight, right? That, which again goes back to this idea of the way that we do things and think that it's landing. If we take a step back and take these kinds of moments for reflection, offer us a way to rethink, right? How is that landing? How is that serving me? How is that serving the person that I love, that I'm having that conversation with? Which is so powerful, because the more awareness that we have, the more we can do something about it. Right. So all great feedback. Thank you, everybody. Okay, so let's keep moving on. So what else gets in the way? We talked about toxic positivity. We talked about vulnerability being difficult. Comparison. I'm sure you all have heard the the phrase comparison is the thief of joy, right? We're looking at things from a deficit-based lens of what others, you know, have or are. And when we do that, we're always gonna normally come out, you know, thinking to ourselves like, well, we're not enough, right? Or we're not this, we're not that. And social media is a great example of this. One example that comes to mind is I think about parents and comparing themselves to other parents in classes in terms of like, you know, oh, I'm not the class mom who packs my kid, you know, a vegan, organic, you know, lunch every day before they go off to school, or, you know, or I can't go on this field trip. And I know that, you know, Susie's mom is on every single field trip, right? All that does is make us feel bad about ourselves. And it doesn't do anything towards us growing or evolving. So it's a form of self-talk that never goes well for us. And what can be really also hard is that society has very contradictory ideas of who we should be, both men, women, everybody, right? So the comparison game is also just a confusing game that's going to lead us in circles, right? For women, it's like, be confident, but don't be pushy, right? For men, it's, you know, be emotionally available, but don't cry, right? Man up. And so regardless of what you're comparing, there's always going to be a darkness and a light, but there's always going to be a version of yourself that you're not. So no matter what, you can't win if you're going to be playing the comparison game. And this comparison game makes it really difficult to be authentic, right? We can't speak our truth if we're held hostage by the idea of what other people think of us. And as we grow up, you know, we have experiences, we start to filter those experiences through others' expectations, because that's how we learn our values, is through others and through experiences. And when we learn a desire for normalcy over authenticity, it becomes a habit, right? I'm going to do this thing because it's palatable, rather than I'm going to do this thing because I want to. I'm going to keep playing soccer because, you know, I know that that like looks good, and that, you know, my parents say that I'm good at it, but do I want to keep playing soccer? Or is this just something that I've done my entire first 18 years of my life, so I'm going to keep doing it, right? That is comparison. Then there's perfectionism, which is the sister of comparison, because perfectionism oftentimes involves comparison. And I think the important thing to point out here, which is, it seems obvious, but it's just a gentle reminder that nobody's perfect, right? Part of the state of being human is that you're not perfect. And that's part of what makes us like beautiful, complex things, creatures. And when we get trapped in the cycle of missing the mark of perfectionism, because we're always going to miss the mark because nobody is perfect, it's this constant loop of never being enough. And when we think about being perfect and doing things perfectly, oftentimes in therapy, I'll ask clients, you know, about like, okay, well, if this was your friend, right, and your friend failed this test, right, what would you say to them? Well, you know, you studied hard and tried your best. And I'm like, well, pause, because I'm just hearing you talk about how you're like a worthless, you know, person and this dumb idiot because you failed your test. But it sounds like you worked hard, and like, tell me what's different, right? Oftentimes our expectations of self and others can look different and skewed, and we can be our own worst critic. I mean, to the 10th degree, right? But if we can pause and remember our humanness, that's where we make space for grace and compassion for ourselves. It's also where we can make space for grace and compassion for others. And when it comes to comparison and perfectionism, I think a really important question to ask yourself is, if I'm coming up against this really difficult feeling, thought, you know, whatever it might be, and decision about what I'm going to do next, like, who says? Who says that I have to do this? Or who says that this is the standard? Or who says that this is how I have to be? Or this is how I'm supposed to act? Who says, right? And if the answer, it comes back to anybody other than me, do I want to continue to hold on to that? Sometimes the answer to that might be yes, but sometimes it might not be, right? Because sometimes that might be this expectation, belief that I've been holding on for my entire life, but that's not me. That's not mine. And the beauty about choice is that you can always choose differently. So that's one thing to think about when we think about perfection. Now, when it comes to comparison and perfectionism, those oftentimes show up in should statements, right? I should go to the gym today. I really should, you know, I really should enlist little Susie in soccer, basketball, and piano because I need to make sure that, she's got, she's well-rounded. I should, like be making home-cooked dinners every night. Well, again, shoulds are an expectation. And who says, right? Going back to what Miss Nancy said at the beginning about like, what do I really believe? Sometimes take a step back and ask yourself that question, like, well, really, who does say that, right? Who is telling me that I need to do those things? Is it me? But it's important to think about shoulds in terms of perfectionism and comparison, as these are expectations that we've already set for ourselves. When we say that we should do something, we're saying, I should have already done that and I'm already not, which means that I'm already failing, right? So shoulds, must, I have to, those are statements that in therapy oftentimes we suggest and recommend and talk about. What if we change that and replace that with a could? Because a could is a choice point. I could choose to do this, or I could choose to not. And that's okay, but there's choice involved in that. Not just me doing it because that's what I've always done, or because I think other people want me to do this, or because I don't want to be seen as, whatever. I don't want to be seen as needy. I don't want to be seen as rude. I don't want to be seen as, mean, whatever it might be, versus what do I want? That's an important question to really ask yourself. And then guilt and shame. These are the feelings that are associated with these three. Yes.
But if I don't do that, I'll feel guilty about it. And how do I handle my guilt?
Is that Nancy?
Yes.
Who am I speaking with? Okay, it's hard sometimes to look. Nancy, you are just leading me through this presentation. You're like the best transitioner, because we're going to talk about it. We're going to talk about how we handle guilt and what that looks like. It's a really important question because it gets in the way. If I feel guilty, oftentimes my reaction is to not do the thing that I want to do because I feel this pull and I feel guilty. I feel shame about it. We're gonna get there. Absolutely. Okay. So we've talked about all these. Oh yeah, you're very welcome. Yeah. So we've talked about all these things that get in the way, right? And the thing is, we can cope to feel different, or we can cope to move through. There's different ways of coping. I know Juliet and Sheba talked about coping skills last time, right? But sometimes we can cope to change how we feel, and that's great if we can. Sometimes the feeling is going to be there and it's not going to change, but we don't have to act on the feeling, right? Because again, a feeling is just a feeling, and a thought is just a thought. You're the one in the driver's seat. If somebody cuts me off in traffic and I'm really angry, I don't get out of my car and bang on that person's window and tell them that I think that, they're a horrible driver, even if I feel angry, because I have control about, what I do and say with my emotions, right? I might like hover my hand over the horn, but I'm not going to do it, right? This idea that we're the ones that are in the driver's seat. So we can cope to feel different, or we can cope to move through. And how do we do that? Well, we have options. We can manage our expectations. We can rework our definition of guilt, Nancy. We can face shame head on, and we can set boundaries. So this graph, or this image of expectations versus reality. Show of hands. Anybody feel like this represents their life sometimes? What they expect versus how it plays out. I'm seeing some nodding heads and some smiles. Yes, okay, right? Things do not always go as planned or as we expect. And this is a graphical representation of that, which I think is helpful to look at when we're talking about expectations versus outcomes in reality, right? Because what we expect, which by the way, is based on our values, right? Versus what the outcome is going to have an effect on us. If I expect to make a homemade meal every night for my family, and the value behind that, because there's values behind every expectation, the value is health. The value is, doing something that I'm doing with love, right? But the outcome is that I have a really busy day and I'm exhausted and I don't have it in me, so I pop something frozen in the oven. Well, then the outcome is less than the expectation, and that missing piece, that gap, that's where we feel disappointment. That's where we feel rejection. That's where we feel loneliness. That's where we feel unworthiness. That's where we feel all the feels of, I didn't meet this expectation, right? That must mean something about me. And here's the thing about outcomes, is that some outcomes are within our control, right? But again, we're human, i.e. like, yeah, it's within my control whether or not I cook, but also I had a really long day, I'm exhausted, right? So does that mean then that I don't allow myself space to be human sometimes and be exhausted? Or sometimes things are outside of our control. If I expect to go outside and have a picnic but it rains, I don't control the weather, right? So we sometimes can work on changing our outcomes by trying to focus on what we can change and what we can do. But sometimes we can do everything within our power and control, and it's still going to fall short of our expectations. And how do we manage that, right? Because if that becomes a story about what we're telling ourselves, that's where guilt and shame are bred. So part of that in that expectations management concept is this idea that we don't have to give up our values to understand that we are human and understand that there are things outside of our control that might affect the outcome. And can we learn how to sit with that, right? So it's not that means that we value things any less. It's not that I mean that I value giving my family a healthy meal or, spending time with them together at the end of the day. But what it also might mean is that I'm allowed to have days where I'm exhausted and I take time to myself while everybody else eats a family style lasagna that they're going to love anyway, right? So that's that idea about managing expectations of ourselves. And you can apply this to relationships as well. But in this context, I think it's important to think about in relation to, how you think about yourself and what you want, your values, those kinds of things. Now, talking about reworking our definition of guilt. When we hear the word guilt, what comes to your mind? For the sake of time, because I want to make sure that I'm getting through this, I'll throw out some, ideas instead of throwing it out to the group. But when you think about guilt, oftentimes you think about, being guilty of a crime, right? Or, that you got caught red-handed with your hand in the cookie jar, right? There's like this moral right or wrongness to it. It's very cut and dry. You've done something wrong. Guilt has a lot of negative connotations to it, right? But think about the times in your life when you feel guilty, but you didn't necessarily do anything wrong, right? Like parents who go out on a date and they leave their kids with the sitter and they feel guilty about the fact while they're at dinner that they left their kids with the sitter. Oh, we should really be home. She had the sniffles, blah, 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 whatever it might be. Or, how do you think she's doing? And they're feeling guilty about leaving their kid. When is it a crime to go on a date with your partner, right? And get a babysitter every once in a while? Or, I think about, somebody has had a really long day. They see a call from a loved one and they just don't have the capacity to take the call. But then they feel horrible about that. And then they're thinking to themselves, oh my gosh, I'm a horrible mom, dad, sister, brother, friend. When it's like, well, if we're really tired, we don't have to talk to everybody every single time that they try to get in touch with us. Like we can talk to them later, but we still feel guilt. Guilt still exists in those situations. So maybe it's not always about necessarily doing something wrong. What if instead we reworked our definition to be that guilt is a values proposition and it's about a choice, right? Going towards the value of going out to eat with my partner while I leave my kid at home is about the values proposition of connecting with my partner in romance and, and my marriage, right? Versus staying home with my kid is going towards the value of motherhood and connection and, playfulness, all those kinds of things. Well, when those happen, right, we talked about how when there's no conflict, it's parallel lines. This is perpendicular right now, right? There's going to be a choice point here. No matter what choice I make, there's going to be a value that I am walking away from while I'm walking towards another. But that doesn't make it wrong. Right? I'm not even here to say that a parent who decides to stay home with their kid instead of go out to dinner is wrong. The point being, you're probably going to feel guilty either way. Oh, I wish we could have gone out to dinner. We could have used the alone time. Or, oh my gosh, I feel bad that we left our kid. There's always going to be in some of these choices, the feeling of guilt, right? So if we can look at it instead as, it's just, if I'm feeling guilt, I must have done something wrong, to being, I'm feeling guilt. What is the values conflict here? Then we can have a different conversation. Now it's not, I'm bad. I now have to, do this, whatever the thing is that is the societally right thing or the professionally right thing or whatever. It can be like, well, let me have a conversation with myself between those two. Can I reconcile them? Right? Like, is it okay for me to cancel plans going out, which is going away from follow through and commitment to my friend, but is going towards rest and is going towards, self-care? Like, yeah, I don't have to go out every single time. I'm allowed to cancel plans. I don't do it all the time, right? That's reconciliation. That's a choice that then if we choose and then we look back and we go, oh, that wasn't it. Guess what? We get to choose again. That's the beautiful thing about behavior and choices. So instead, if it's about what takes precedent in the moment, what value takes precedent in the moment, we might still feel guilty. The feeling itself might not change, but we can change our relationship to the feeling, i.e., grief does not, or guilt does not mean that I am morally wrong. Guilt means that I have a values conflict here. My feeling is not a fact. The feeling might be there. It might be there regardless, but my feeling is not a fact, right? So that means that we're looking at guilt a lot differently than we would be if we hadn't had this conversation. Oh, okay, keep going with time. So I think it's important to also differentiate the difference between guilt and shame. Guilt is about behavior. I feel guilty, I lied. Shame is about who we are as a person. I am a liar, right? There is a difference between those two. Shame is this visceral, nasty feeling that leads us to be disconnected, to feel shunned, to feel isolated, and it reduces and eliminates the hope for connection and belonging. Those two things that I keep bringing up that I'm saying are so important for us to have, right? So shame is really, oftentimes when we're feeling guilt and we're really struggling, it's really shame in disguise, and having a name for it now, I think, helps us differentiate. Now, facing shame means that we are basically saying everybody has it. And so if we can name it and identify it, we can do something about it. So Brene Brown has this idea of shame shields, and that there's different ways that we meet shame. And our shield is the way that we try to think that we're deflecting it or moving away from it or hiding from it. But really we're not. We're just delaying or ignoring the inevitable that it's there, right? So moving away in terms of a shame shield is when we withdraw, we hide, we silence ourselves, we keep secrets. Moving towards shame is where we seek to appease and please people. So this is where, it's like, oh my God, you're right. I know I'm such an idiot, right? It can like lead to very self-depreciating kind of comments. And then a shame shield that moves against shame is one where we try to gain power over others, and we can be kind of aggressive. We're using shame to fight shame, right? Well, you, da-da-da, right? Or at least I'm not, blah, 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 right? So when we think about that, those shields aren't doing anything to help us face our shame. They're deflecting it. And this is where we're having this battle again between the ideal identities of what we think people want us to be and how we want to be seen, and our unwanted identities, which oftentimes are just vulnerable human parts of ourselves. But information is power, right? If we know what to call shame, we know how to recognize it, we can do something about it. Shame is a universal feeling. Everybody feels it. And what we know from research is that empathy is the antidote to shame. Because if I can say to myself or somebody else that whatever that shame is, right? So I didn't, make it to my kid's recital. I feel guilty that I didn't make it to my kid's recital. I'm a bad mother. The shame statement there is I'm a bad mother. If I share that out loud and I speak it into existence, empathy comes into play. No, you're not. This was one opportunity, right? And here's the circumstances around it. And everybody else, all the rest of the family got to see it. And this is not the last recital, right? And that doesn't mean that we toxic positivity it away and not talk about that person's feelings of feeling let down. But what we're not going to say is this does not mean something about you. This does not make you a bad mom, right? Empathy is the antidote to shame. And we can grow our resilience towards admitting and acknowledging and dealing with shame, which thereby creates empathy for ourselves and others, when we learn how to accept our feelings for what they are, and we learn how to speak shame into existence, which again is vulnerability in action. That's us putting it out there, and even just saying it out loud makes a difference, because now there's room for someone, even if it's for myself, to challenge it, right? Like, again, says who that you're a bad mom because you didn't cook a homemade dinner, says who that you are a unworthy or horrible employee because you decided to take a vacation day, those kinds of things. So this cute little cartoon is a great way to think about how we can practice acceptance. Remember, acceptance does not have to equal approval, right? This is accepting the fact that we're feeling shame or just accepting any uncomfortable or unwanted emotion. We can acknowledge it, we can allow space for it to be there, and we can accommodate it. The natural reaction for shame and other unwanted feelings is for us to push things away and run in the other direction, push it down, push it back, right? Which is a normal reaction. But what if instead we welcomed it, right? Acknowledge that it's there. Oof, that happened in this meeting. I really said something that I didn't mean to say, and I feel embarrassed right now. Oh gosh, I'm feeling embarrassed. I'm feeling shame, right? Acknowledge it. Allow it to be there. Okay, yeah, that happened. And I'm feeling really embarrassed about it. Not, Jackie, you're fine. You're fine. You're fine. Keep going with your day. You're fine, right? I'm going to allow space for it. Okay, yeah, no, that happened. And that was not an ideal moment for me. And I am feeling embarrassed and shame about that. And then accommodate. And accommodate means, what do I want to do with that? This is the choice point where we get to come back to our values and we get to check in with ourselves. What do I want to do with this? So I noticed that this, I'm feeling really crappy after this meeting with my boss. I'm giving myself permission to feel that thing because feelings are not the enemy and I'm allowed to feel this way, whether or not it's based in fact, it's how I feel. But what do I want to do with it, right? Do I want to have a conversation with my boss to tell them about how I feel? Do I want to sit down for a second and just give myself that internal validation to say, hey, it's okay to be embarrassed right now? Do I want to talk to the coworker who I've identified as a safe space to hold my vulnerability if I share with them like, oh my gosh, you're not going to believe how this meeting just went. But I get to decide. That's the beautiful thing. We are the ones who choose what we do with our thoughts and our feelings. We're the ones that choose what we do with our shame, which means that we can choose to acknowledge it. We can choose to speak it into existence. And then the last thing, which I know we're running up on time, so Gerald, please stop me because I can post this slide if people need to wrap up and go. I don't want to hold people over their time. But the last thing is, once we can acknowledge these things about ourselves, we can admit these things to ourselves. Now we have an opportunity to communicate that and communicate our needs and our values, right? So share how we're actually feeling or what we're actually thinking or why we don't want to do something or why we do want to do something. But we're building this awareness and the skills to build our awareness within ourselves to be able then to communicate it to other people. And doing this is like building a muscle. It takes time. So if you don't feel like you're good at it, that's okay, right? You don't go to the gym and pick up 200 pounds and start squatting. You might just start with, just body weight. And then you might move on to 20 pounds and then go from there. But everybody can learn how to communicate their needs and values. And you can be gentle and firm about how you do this and still be kind. Because another thing is people say, well, I feel guilty. I don't want to be mean. Well, it's not mean to tell people how you feel or communicate your needs. You can do that in a very gentle and firm way and still be kind. One way to do that is by setting a boundary, right? You have a responsibility to people, but you are never responsible for them. Now I'm talking here in relation to grown adults that are adult to adult relationships, right? Kids are a different story, but we have a responsibility to people. That does not mean that we are responsible for managing their emotions. That doesn't mean that we're responsible for figuring out how to solve their problems. And quite honestly, the more that we take on those responsibilities for them, the less space we're giving them to figure out those things on their own. Like the comment earlier about when we're not giving people the space to feel through a feeling and figure it out, right? We're not giving them that opportunity if we're doing it for them, which is where the writing reflex comes into play. We are all natural problem solvers. It is a very easy thing to be like, well, why don't you try this? Or have you ever thought of doing this, right? When in doing that, oftentimes what we're doing is we're saving, right? We're jumping in and we're saving, where a powerful thing could be to say, oh my gosh, it sounds like that's so hard. You're having such a hard time. I'm here for you. Absolutely. I'm so glad that you came to me to tell me about that. What do you think you're going to do? Right? You're putting that onus back on other people and you're letting them be responsible for their life, but you're still there to support them. Boundaries aren't just to protect you. They are there to protect the relationship. The idea being that boundaries are not selfish. Really and truly, they can be with the idea of having the relationship in mind. But if I have boundaries and that makes me not resentful, that means I can continue to love and appreciate this relationship versus not getting what I need because I don't have boundaries. And then all of a sudden hating this person, right? So really and truly, they're with the relationship in mind. And they can be interpersonal and intrapersonal. They can be between people. Or a boundary can be with myself. Jackie, you told yourself today is a day for rest. Do not open your computer and check that email. Told yourself today is a day for rest, then girl, go ahead and take that day for rest, right? And sometimes having a hard conversation includes setting a boundary, but sometimes having a hard conversation is just sharing how you feel. Talk about this a lot in couples counseling, right? Remember that we want to frame the way that we're thinking and talking about these things within the bounds of personal control and accountability. We're using I statements because we can only talk about what we think and feel, right? And what we are responsible for. And if we're going to use a you statement, it needs to be about a behavior. So not, I felt hurt earlier when you were a jerk, because that is like a judgment statement. But I felt hurt earlier when you didn't respond to, you know, my voicemail and my text that I felt kind of ignored, right? What we did is we used the thing that happened, not said something that's critical or demeaning or contemptuous, disrespectful about the other person. So using I statements helps to alleviate the possibility for defensiveness and criticism to come into play in the conversations. And if you get really overwhelmed, take a break. It is okay to take breaks. I think one of the biggest marriage myths that sometimes grinds my gears is this idea of like not going to bed mad and like you can't do it, can't leave a conversation before you figure it out. It's actually not true, and sometimes it can be more damaging to continue to force a conversation if it is just not being productive. What we know and what research tells us is that if you're feeling really overwhelmed and this conversation is going nowhere, take 20 to 30 minutes, soothe yourself physiologically, do something that you enjoy to calm down. Don't sit there and stew. That's not the idea. Distract yourself or do something that soothes you. That's a coping skill. And then come back to the conversation. And once you come back to that conversation, you can be more level-headed and be less critical and defensive, which we all can get. That's also a human reaction. But know that, having hard conversations aren't easy, but they're worth it because the relationship is worth it if you want to preserve it, right? And it also means that then I can be more honest about who I am and what I want, which goes back to this idea of vulnerability and authenticity, right? Having hard conversations sometimes is saying, I know every, Saturday we get up and we do go on a hike, but I actually think it would be really nice some days to, just like wake up and stay in and have, breakfast at home instead of getting up and getting going. It's kind of nice to rest and relax, right? So sometimes these things are about sharing a vulnerable and authentic part of ourselves that maybe we're just sharing for the first time. Okay, last thing, self-talk. It's just as important to think about how we talk to other people as it is to think about how we talk to ourselves. So 2 questions that you can ask yourself to try to build self-compassion and grace. How would I want my loved one to be treated in this moment? And if I'm not treating or talking to myself in that way, can I take a look at that? And what would the kid, Jackie, Martha, Gerald, whoever, what would the kid version of me want to hear, need to hear, benefit from hearing? Because if we wouldn't say it to a kid, we probably shouldn't say it to ourselves. Or we can, that's just probably not going to be the most helpful, kind, and gentle way of saying it. So to wrap up, life is what's happening in this moment, right? That's the thing about values, choices, and authenticity is that it comes down to the day-to-day choices that we make. And we make hundreds of choices in a day about what we do in our behavior. It's all about choices. And when we're practicing the idea of leading with our values to be more authentic, we're not always going to get it right, and that's okay. Practice doesn't make perfect, but practice does make progress, right? So know that regardless of the choices that you choose, you're going to have opportunities to choose differently. So don't beat yourself up too hard if you think to yourself like, wow, I really did that just because I got peer pressured into it, or wow, I really did that because, that's what my family wanted to do and I didn't want any part of that. Like, that's okay. You can choose differently next time. That's the air of being human. But when you do, you can choose to hopefully more and more with each day, let go of who you think that you're supposed to be and embrace who you are, because that at the crux of it is what authenticity is all about. And that is all. And I know I had to breeze through the end of that, and I'm so sorry because I wanted to get through all of it, but there it is. And now we are all our authentic selves. I can see the difference in everybody's faces. You look beautiful. Yes. Does anybody have any questions,
Thank you so
comments?
much.
Yeah, you're very welcome.
Can we get the slides? Will you share the slides?
I can share are there specific slides in general that you wanted to take a look at?
Just the general information, be able to go back and look at it again, that kind of idea.
So we're going to post, Gerald is going to be posting a couple of worksheets that correlate directly with what we've talked about today as it relates to shame. And then a couple of podcasts and TED Talks about Brene. I can put together like a general overview kind of fact sheet about what we've talked about, and I can give that to her so she can post it as well.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
We've also recorded the class, and it will be on the Pathways to Discipleship website, fpcpathways.com. So you could see them and hear Jackie talk through them on the web.
Perfect. That's great. You don't need to do anything more.
Oh, okay. Very good. Anybody else?
Thank you so much.
Jackie, thank you. This
Very
could be a
welcome.
full
good.
weekend workshop. So we really appreciate you being with us. And thanks for everybody for sticking with it. And we will see you next week in the classroom and on Zoom, wherever you're most comfortable. So thanks.
Thank you, Gerald. Thank you, Jackie.
Thank you all for coming. Have a good day. Enjoy your snow day.